This video is sponsored by Star Trek Fleet Command. Brutal, savage, and bound by dark pacts, the Darkoath emerge from the waste to cause carnage. Learn how to paint the warriors of the Darkoath tribes and bring their grim fury to life in this video. A huge thank you to Games Workshop for sending this out to me early so I can get a head start and create some content. Now we're going to do this a little bit differently to how we normally do. I'm going to show you how to paint it in a really basic way using contrast, and I'm also going to show you how to up that level by doing some highlighting. Let's get painting. Now I've primed the model with Agrax Brown spray from Colourforge, and I've sprayed Wraithbone across the top. If you haven't got these, don't worry, you can probably get away just by using something like Wraithbone or even a white primer. The first thing we're going to do is paint the metallics, and we're going to do a coppery brass colour on some elements. So for that, we need Runelord Brass. Now I've thinned this a little bit so it's smooth and flows nicely over the model. We will go in and add a second coat in some of those recesses where it doesn't quite cover properly. We'll paint all the silver next, and the colour I'm going to use that is dark aluminium from Vallejo Metal Colour. This is another paint that flows very nicely off a brush, but if you haven't got this, you can use something like Lead Belcher or Socote Silver. It's just generally that gunmetal colour that we want to go for. And now I'm going to base the horse, and the colour I'm using for this is Cygor Brown contrast paint. Now this is quite an opaque contrast paint. It's kind of a reddy brown colour. The reason I want to do it now is because I'm going to shade the horse, the bronze and the silver all at the same time. It's really important that the Cygor Brown is dry before we do this next step. So we take some Nuln Oil and wash this all over the Cygor Brown, all over the dark aluminium, and all over that Runelord Brass as well. We don't want this to pool too heavily, we just want it to darken the surfaces and give us a nice little bit of depth in all those recesses. While we wait for that Nuln Oil to dry, let's move from fantasy to science fiction, and let me tell you about this video sponsor, Star Trek Fleet Command. I love a bit of Star Trek, and The Next Generation is one of my favourite TV shows. I often have it on in the background as I paint, and it reminds me of growing up watching it with my grandfather. Now, I've played Fleet Command for a number of years, and I worked really hard to get my Romulan auger. Fleet Command is totally free to download on desktop and mobile devices. I love that you can recruit legendary characters to crew iconic ships from over 50 years of Star Trek stories and send them on missions of exploration to expand your territory. Kirk, Spock, Picard, Riker, Janeway, Troy, Pike, Number One, they are all here. To celebrate the return of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, a new event is launching. Prepare for epic battles in the mysterious and treacherous worlds from the show. Face off against fierce foes like the cunning Klingon and the reptilian Gorn as you fight for glory and domination. There will be dedicated missions and events based on the lore from the show as well. Download Star Trek Fleet Command using the link in the description of this video and support the channel even further by upgrading your Operations Center to level 5. I may even see you in the game. To make the silver look a little bit dirtier and worn, we're then going to take some Agrax Earthshade and paint this all over the silver areas. Now again, really important that that Nuln Oil is completely dry before we do this. In a similar vein, we're going to take some Coelia Green Shade, which is a nice bluey green shade colour, and paint this over all of the brass areas. Now again, really important that this is completely dry before we attempt this step. And again, we don't want this to pool too heavily, so if you do find it's looking a little bit too heavy or it's settling in any areas, then just wick it away before it dries so that we just get a stain rather than deep pools of it. We'll start highlighting that brass, and the colour we're going to use is Runelord Brass again. So I've not got too much on my brush, but I'm not going to be highlighting this in a traditional way. I'm just going to be tapping it on those areas that are going to catch the most light. And this is a really easy step because if you've got a light above the model, you can see which part is actually catching. So just tap it along there and start to build up that highlight. We'll finish the brass off with some Canoptek Alloy, which is a nice bright colour. And generally we're going to do the same thing as the last step, but we want to keep this inside the Runelord Brass. And when we've got any sharp edges, such as on the headpiece of the horse, we're just going to drag our brush along it to get a nice crisp highlight. To highlight the silver, I'm going to go back to dark aluminium. Now, generally where we've got sharp edges, we're going to drag the brush along them to get nice crisp highlights. Now, this isn't a huge jump in terms of the value, but what we're looking to do here is just highlight some of the general silver areas. Where we've got the sharp weapons, obviously those edges are going to be quite well kept. but we are going to add some scratches along them just to make it look like they're a little bit worn. Finally, we'll take some chrome from Vallejo Model Air, which is a nice bright silver colour, and drag this along the weapon edges. This just gives them that extra little bit of shine and makes them look a little bit sharper. If you haven't got chrome, you can use something like Stormhose Silver. We're going to paint the horse flesh next, and we're going to do this in a little bit of a different way to normal. So I'm going to take some Dryad Bark, and what I'm going to do is thin it down on my palette, and then I'm going to take quite a big brush. Now, this is an old brush. I'm going to wipe off most of the Dryad Bark, and I'm going to stipple it across the flesh of the horse, focusing on those areas that are facing upwards and that are going to catch the most light. And what you'll see is it might go on quite bright, but then it'll blend down into the horse, and you can slowly build this up to get the highlight colour that you want. I'm generally focusing this on all of the musculature of the horse. I'm then going to do exactly the same using Gorthor Brown, but I'm focusing this a little bit more than I did last time, still trying to get it into that musculature and on the areas that are going to catch the most light and build up that highlight nicely. Now, this isn't going to give you the smoothest highlight in the world, but it will give you something that looks a little bit like matted fur from a distance, and that's the overall look we're going for with these Darkoath. The final highlight we'll do on the horse is with some Baneblade Brown. Again, I've thinned this down very much like I have before, but it's quite a thin paint anyway. So what I'll make sure to do is to let it dry, and if I need to go back over it with some Gorthor Brown, I will. This part is really just having a little look to see what I like, and I'm going to focus this on the front legs and the neck of the horse and the head. I'm not going to worry about the back end of the horse, because if you look at the box art, it's a little bit lighter towards the front. So just build this up nice and gently, and you'll start to get a really nice transition there. To accentuate some of the highlights, such as on the ears of the horse and also on the fur of the horse's legs, I'm just going to take some pure Baneblade Brown and apply this in a traditional layer style. It'll just give you a little bit more of an opaque layer, and this again will just blend in nicely with everything we've done so far. You'll notice on the box art there's some chaos iconography on the neck of the horse. Now I think this has been painted on in terms of how it looks there rather than a brand, so I'm going to try and paint it as well. The colour I'm going to use is Karak Stone, and I'm going to roughly follow the picture on the box art by drawing a diamond in, some horns, and then I'm going to put in some of the arrows pointing off as well. Now this is obviously a chaos sigil of some sort, so I'm not too worried about getting it absolutely accurate. What I am worried about is making sure that it reads like what's on the box art. So I'm just going to take my time. If I need to fill in around the edges with some of the colours from underneath, then I'll do that as well. To accentuate that effect, I'm going to take a little bit of Ushabti Bone. Now, if you haven't got this, you can just mix a little bit of white into the Karak Stone. I'm just going to stipple this along the shape that I've already painted. And this is just going to give it that effect of looking that little bit rougher, that kind of painted on effect, which I think is going to look quite effective. There's also some red dots painted across the middle of this sigil. I don't know if it's blood or if it's paint, but I'm going to use some Flesh Tearers Red. And really all I'm doing is I'm just going to stab to try and get some dots. I'm not too worried about them being overly tidy. I just want to get that red effect. While I've got the Flesh Tearers Red out, I'm going to paint the undermat that goes under the saddle. So I do have to be careful around bits I've already finished here when it comes to silver. But generally, I'm just going to work this Flesh Tearers Red across. Now, because this is going over what is essentially a zenithal prime, a light colour over a dark colour, it's going to settle into those recesses. It should give me a nice little bit of contrast, if you will pardon the pun. I'm also going to do any wraps around the weapons with the Flesh Tearers Red. Next up, we're going to paint the trousers, and the colour I'm using for this is Rakarth Flesh. Now, I've thinned this a very tiny bit, but I don't need to use too much. So I'm just going to paint it over the trousers. I'm also going to paint it over the bedroll that's on the back of the horse as well. To shade it, I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade. Now, this can be a little overpowering, so I'm making sure I haven't got very much on my brush. I'm just going to let it go into those recesses. Because you've got lots of folds and you've got the wraps on there, then it's going to look really quite nice and really help you pick out that detail. To do that, I'll go back to Rakarth Flesh, and I'm going to focus just on the trousers, and I'm going to catch those raised folds, leaving the darker colours in the recesses. And I'm not going to worry too much about the strapping, because I'm going to paint that a different colour later on. Finally, I'll highlight that with Pallid Witch Flesh. If you haven't got this, again, just mix a little bit of white into the Rakarth Flesh. You'll get something similar that you can use. It's only a very small highlight we're doing here. We're not going completely overboard. I wanted to paint some of his dress a little bit different to the box art. To that end, I'm taking some Leviathan Purple contrast paint and painting this over his man dress that he is wearing. I'm not sure if that's the correct term. It's the term I've given it. I am conscious I'm using a lot of paint in this video, and that's always something people pull me up on. You don't have to use all the paint I'm using. Generally, you can just get away with that contrast level and add more later on. And don't forget, if you're painting this Darkoath, the chances are you're painting an entire detachment of them, so you will need some of those extra colours. Next up, I'm going to base all of the hair, and the colour I'm using for this is Black Templar. Now, the reason I'm using this is because it settles into the recesses nicely and gives me a decent highlight. It's probably one of my favourite contrast paints to use. So just working over all that hair, of course being careful around areas you've already finished. There's quite a bit on the horse's tail, there's a lot of hair tying these headless heads up as well. And the other thing I'm going to do is paint anything I want to be black leather. So I'm going to paint the underskirt, I'm going to paint the wraps on his forearms and also the wraps on his legs as well. So if you're anything like me, you've been a little bit untidy. So I need to tidy up some of the areas that I'm going to use more contrast paint on. So the colour I'm using for this is Corax White, which is really nice. I love it. I know a lot of people don't, but for me, it's good. And what I'm looking to do is just paint cross areas that I'm going to colour in later on that I've been a little bit messy with so far. Now, you're probably watching me paint this Darkoath Chieftain. If you're wondering what the rest of the set is like, is it worth picking up? What are the other models like? Then check out my Patreon. I've got a free box review. You don't have to sign up and pay for anything. You can watch it for free on my Patreon. I'll go through, I'll talk about all the models and show you them all as well before you go out and buy this box. I'm going to paint all of the leather straps next, and this is one of my favourite colours to use, Gharaghak Sewer. So I'm just going to paint this over the areas I've just tidied up, and that has the benefit that it's going to be much brighter, much lighter, which is really nice. The one thing with Gharaghak Sewer, you just got to watch it doesn't pool too much in the recesses because you'll get a very dark spot if it does. So I'm just dragging it out and painting across all the leather straps. Next, I'm going to do all of the fur, and the colour I'm using for this is Griff Charger Grey. Really, you can use whatever colour you want here, but I wanted something that was a little bit stark and stood out against the rest of the model, so it's the Griff Charger Grey for me. I also painted all of the runes using Basilicanum Grey. This is a very straightforward step. Just pop it on there, let it flow into the recesses, and try not to spill it anywhere else. Now, when it comes to painting the severed head, you've got lots of options. So I've got these different contrast paints here. I've got Darkoath Flesh, Guilliman Flesh, Fireslayer Flesh. You can use even Rakarth Flesh, Mortarion Grime, Kroak Green. There are so many options. Just experiment. You can always paint over it with white paint and start again if you don't like the effect you've got. I'm just going to work through the different colours and paint them on. So I'm using Guilliman Flesh for a few areas, in particular that nice bit of fleece fur that he's wearing. I'm going to use that on there. I'm going to pop it on some of the heads, and really I'm just going to interchange things like Fireslayer Flesh as well. I'm going to go back to Cygor Brown as well to paint some darker skin tones. I think this is a nice way to add variation in there. You can, of course, do this in a traditional layer style. I just think for me, painting this guy, it's going to be easier to do contrast paint method. I'm going to use some Mortarion Grime on there as well, just to give a really pallid, dead look, because don't forget, some of these heads, they're clearly a bit more decomposed. They've been hanging there a lot longer than the other ones. And then finally, I'm going to base the flesh of the rider using Darkoath Flesh. What else am I going to use? Now, I wasn't really happy with 1 or 2 coats of this, so I ended up putting 3 coats on there to get a nice bronze skin tone. I didn't sell for this in the end. I changed it to something else, but I just want you to see how this looks as a contrast option. It looks fine, but I went back and I changed it later on. So if you followed along so far, you've got a perfectly passable model for the tabletop using mainly contrast paints. But if you want to kick it up, let's start the highlighting process. So first of all, I'm going back to that Corax White that I've got on my palette, and I'm going to highlight all of the fur. So this is a nice, easy step. I'm just dragging it along the shape of the model, getting a nice crisp highlight, leaving that Griff Charger Grey in the recesses. Next up, I'm going to highlight all of the red. And the colour I'm using for this is Wazdakka Red, which is a nice desaturated red. And I'm not doing it in a traditional line highlight, I'm stippling it on. And the reason I'm stippling it on is I want it to look rough, and I want it to look old, and I want it to look worn. I'll finish up that red highlight using Squig Orange, which is again is a very nice desaturated colour. Stipple it inside the Wazdakka Red, and you will be good to go. I wasn't really sure what colour to highlight the Gharaghak Sewer with until I had a brainwave. Well, I thought it was a brainwave, you may disagree, but I'm using some Balor Brown. Now, this is very thin paint again, so all I'm doing is I'm dragging the brush along the shape of the leather, but rather than it being one long drag, it's just a little bit of tapping to give it some rough edges, and this is starting to come out really nicely. I quite like this highlight on Gharaghak Sewer, and like I said, I'm a little bit impressed with myself. I'm going to highlight that purple with a little bit of Genestealer purple. I'll probably put this on a little bit too thick, but it's not too bad. And honestly, you could probably get away without doing this highlights. It's the Leviathan Purple is a very nice colour, and it does settle in those recesses nicely. We'll highlight all of the hair next, and we're going to highlight the hair and the black leather differently, because it's a good idea to show you how you can get different texture effects, even though you've got the same base colour. So for the hair, we're going to take the Skavenblight Dinge, and we're going to highlight it. Generally, this is an easy and straightforward step, because we're just dragging our brush down along the hair, leaving the darker colours in the recesses, and then when it dries, it'll give you a nice blended effect. The Skavenblight Dinge is quite thin. You do need a lot of it to get a good layer, but it works quite well in this instance. We'll then take some Stormvermin Fur, and we'll be a little bit more deliberate with this and just focus this along those areas and dragging it along the sharp raised parts. This will give us a thinner highlight, which again will just give that effect that you've got strands of hair rather than a big block of hair. Going to start to add some colour into the flesh all over the model. So the first thing I'm going to do is take some Mortarion Grime and paint this over the flesh of his cloak. Then when that's dry, I'm going to add some Kroak Green. Now, I don't want this to settle too much in the recesses. I want it to be fairly subtle, so I'm going to clear a lot of this away. And this now gives me a totally different effect on that skin. I'm going to use this on some of the dead heads as well, because it'll just help accentuate some of those features, the puffy eyes, as the decomposition starts to set in. To highlight the darker skin, I've mixed a little bit of Dawnstone in with that Cygor Brown to get it almost looks a little bit like Gorthor Brown, but it's more grey, so it gives you that effect of a more pallid, more dead-like colour. I'm just going to highlight this across the Cygor Brown severed heads as you would normally. I'm then going to take some Flayed One Flesh and use this to highlight the lighter skin coloured heads, focusing on things like noses and brows and any puffy bits on there. Finally, I'll use the Flayed One Flesh to give some rough scratches along the cloak that he's wearing, just to give the effect that it's all been scraped away from the bone. Now, like I said, I wasn't really happy with the flesh, and I wasn't happy painting over it and building up a highlight, so I started again. I took some Nightquester flesh, and I base coated all of this. Now, this is a nice, warm, darker brown colour, and I think it's just closer to that Darkoath effect you'll see on the box art. I then shaded this with Agrax Earthshade, making sure it wasn't too heavy a shade, and I spread it out and it didn't pool too heavily. I then went back to Nightquester Flesh and started highlighting the model, focusing on those parts that are going to catch the most light. For example, across his chest, his back muscles, his bicep, shoulder, and of course his face. I then made a 50-50 mix of Kislev Flesh and Nightquester Flesh and used this for the final highlight. Now, I kept this quite thin, so I could build it up if I wanted to. So particularly across the chest, it's not going to cover in one hit, but as I put a second coat on, it will, and it'll start to give a brighter spot there. For the face, I just dragged it along the nose and the brow and his frown lines to get a nice highlight, and similarly on the fingers as well. The last thing to do is paint the black leather. So the first thing I did was take some Dark Reaper and highlighted all of these elements. So we've got things like the underskirt, we've got the wraps on his arms, and of course the wraps on his legs. Lastly, I took some Thunderhawk blue, and I did exactly the same thing, but painted it inside the Dark Reaper to give a nice brighter highlight there. I'm really happy with how this has turned out. Generally, I'm really happy with how the Darkoath Chieftain has come out. So there we are. Let's pop him on his base and have a look at the final model. So there we go, the Darkoath Chieftain is done. I'll be putting a short out on how to paint the base. It's really easy and straightforward. Remember, if you want to check out a review of the full box, it's on my Patreon, absolutely free. Thank you so much to my patrons who do support me. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like and a comment down below. And don't forget to check out Star Trek Fleet Command using the link in the description and upgrade your Ops Center to level 5 to support the channel further. I'll see you next time.